It was supposed to be just another evening, the kind where nothing special happens and life feels predictable. I had spent my day at the community center, doing what I love most, helping kids learn, grow, and dream bigger than the challenges they face every day. It's not glamorous work, but it fills me with purpose. After finishing up, I decided to stop by the grocery store for a few things: bread, milk, maybe some snacks for my niece's birthday party later that week. Nothing fancy, nothing out of the ordinary. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I left the store, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep purple and orange. The air carried a slight chill, refreshing after the long day. As I walked back to my car, keys jingling in one hand and a paper bag tucked under my arm, I noticed a police cruiser slowing down beside me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Police cars pass through neighborhoods all the time. It's part of their job, right? But then the car came to an abrupt stop ahead of me, its tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart skipped a beat as both doors swung open, and two officers stepped out. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, stared at me through narrowed eyes. His partner, shorter but no less intimidating, scanned the area like he expected trouble to jump out from behind a tree. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The hum of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, even the sound of my own breathing. All I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. "Sir," the taller officer called out, his voice cutting through the quiet night like a knife. "Stop right there." I froze mid-step, my mind racing. What did they want? Why were they stopping me? I hadn't done anything wrong. Still, I raised my free hand slightly, showing them I wasn't holding anything dangerous. "Is something wrong, officer?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm and respectful. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand resting on the grip of his holster. That small movement sent a wave of unease coursing through me. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" he finally asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. "No, sir," I replied honestly. I haven't done anything wrong. And it was true. I'd been minding my own business, heading home after a routine trip to the store. But as I stood there, looking into the officer's stern face, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about what I had done. It was about how I looked. A black man in a hoodie, walking alone at night. To them, that apparently made me suspicious. "I'll ask again," the officer said, his patience wearing thin. "Do you know why we're here?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "No, sir," I repeated. "But if you tell me what's going on, I can help clear things up." The second officer muttered something under his breath, though I couldn't quite catch it. The taller one ignored me, reaching instead for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "What?" "No," I protested, instinctively taking a step back. "You don't have any proof. This is ridiculous. Resisting arrest will only make things worse," the officer shot back, his tone icy. Before I knew it, cold metal clamped around my wrists, and I was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser. As we sped away, sirens blaring, I stared out the window, watching the world blur past. How had this happened? How could they mistake me for someone else based solely on, well, me? The ride to the police station felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. The back seat of the cruiser was cramped and uncomfortable, the faint smell of old leather and cleaning products filling the air. My hands were cuffed behind my back, making it hard to sit properly. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through my body, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm raging inside my mind. How could this be happening? I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. One minute, I was just a guy heading home from the grocery store, minding my own business. The next, I was being treated like a criminal, all because someone decided that a black man in a hoodie matched the vague description of a suspect. It didn't matter that I hadn't done anything wrong, or that I had no idea what they were accusing me of. In their eyes, I was guilty until proven innocent. When we arrived at the station, the officers wasted no time dragging me inside. The building smelled like stale coffee and sweat, a nauseating combination that made my stomach churn. They led me past rows of desks where other officers sat typing on computers or talking on phones, barely glancing up as I walked by. To them, this was just another day on the job. But for me, it felt like stepping into a nightmare. They took me to a small room with harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. One of the officers, Officer Daniels, according to his badge, started asking questions. "What's your name?" he demanded, his tone sharp and impatient. "Marcus Thompson," I replied, meeting his gaze despite the fear gnawing at me. "And I already told you, I haven't done anything wrong." Daniels ignored me, scribbling something down on a clipboard. "Where were you tonight between 7 and 9 p.m.? "At the grocery store," I said firmly. "You can check the security footage if you don't believe me." He exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Grayson, who smirked like he'd heard some kind of joke. "We'll see about that," Daniels muttered before turning his attention back to me. "And what about these clothes? Why are you dressed like this?" I looked down at myself, a plain black hoodie and jeans, and felt a surge of frustration. Like what? This is what I wear every day. Are you seriously questioning my outfit now? Daniels leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "Listen, pal, we got a report about a robbery earlier tonight. The suspect fits your description. Black male, dark clothing, seen in the area around the same time. You telling me that's just a coincidence?" My jaw tightened. "It's not a coincidence. It's racism. You're arresting me because of how I look, not because of any evidence." Grayson snorted, shaking his head. "Save the lecture, buddy. If you're innocent, then prove it." Prove it. Those two words echoed in my mind, fueling my anger. How was I supposed to prove my innocence when they hadn't even given me a chance to explain? When they'd already decided I was guilty based on nothing more than stereotypes? After what felt like hours of questioning, they finally moved me to a holding cell. It was tiny, barely big enough to pace in, with concrete walls and a metal bench bolted to the floor. 3 other men were already inside, each looking as confused and frustrated as I felt. One guy sat silently in the corner, staring at the wall like he was trying to disappear. Another paced back and forth, muttering under his breath about how unfair the system was. The third man introduced himself as Jamal, offering a weak smile and saying, "Welcome to the club." Man, I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sank onto the bench, leaning my head against the cold wall. My thoughts raced in circles. What would happen next? Would anyone believe me when I said I was innocent? And how long would I have to stay here before someone realized they'd made a mistake? Time seemed to crawl by. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. I couldn't tell anymore. The hum of voices outside the cell blended with the occasional clang of metal doors opening and closing. Each sound reminded me that I wasn't free, that I was trapped in a place I didn't belong. Finally, the door creaked open, and a different officer appeared. He looked younger than the others, his face pale and drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. "You," he said, pointing at me. "Come with me." Something in his tone caught my attention. Not authority or aggression, but hesitation, fear. Whatever it was, it made my stomach twist into knots. As I stood up and followed him out of the cell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything, for better or worse. The young officer led me down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. My heart was still racing, though I tried to steady my breathing as we walked. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. I didn't know where he was taking me or why, but something about his demeanor made me uneasy. He hadn't said a word since calling me out of the holding cell, and his silence only added to the tension. We stopped in front of a door marked Interrogation Room B. The officer hesitated for a moment before opening it and gesturing for me to go inside. The room was small and windowless, with a single table in the center and 2 chairs on either side. A camera mounted in the corner blinked red, recording every move. It felt like stepping into a scene from a movie, except this wasn't fiction. This was real life, and I was the unwilling star. Sitting across the table was Lieutenant Harris, a man whose face I recognized from news reports. He was older, with graying hair and deep lines etched into his weathered face. His badge gleamed under the harsh light, and his uniform was perfectly pressed, but there was something off about him tonight. His usual air of authority seemed to be replaced by nervousness, apprehension. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice low and measured, "do you know why you're here?" I clenched my fists under the table, fighting to keep my emotions in check. "Yes," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "Because someone decided I fit the vague description of a suspect. But I already told you, I didn't do anything." Harris sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he exchanged a glance with the young officer who had brought me in. Whatever passed between them made my stomach churn even more. "Look, son," Harris said finally, his voice softer now. "There's been a development." A development? What did that mean? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was this some kind of trick? Another tactic to get me to confess to something I hadn't done? What kind of development? I asked cautiously, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. Harris hesitated again, then slid a folder across the table toward me. "Take a look at this," he said, his tone almost apologetic. I opened the folder slowly, unsure of what I'd find inside. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary document, just a photo ID and some official-looking paperwork. But when I saw the name beneath the picture, my blood ran cold. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Director of Community Outreach Programs, advisor to the mayor's office. It was me, or rather, it wasn't. Because according to this document, I wasn't just some random guy walking home from the grocery store. To these officers, I was someone important. Someone connected directly to City Hall. Someone whose face had appeared in flyers promoting anti-crime initiatives and alongside the mayor during press conferences. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. How could they not have known who I was? Hadn't they checked my ID when they arrested me? Or had they simply assumed I was lying about my identity too? "This," I stammered, pointing at the ID. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" Harris nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Yes, it does. And I want you to know, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Whoever made this mistake will be held accountable." Accountable. The word sounded hollow, like an empty promise. Sure, they'd apologize, and maybe even discipline the officers involved, but would it really change anything? Would it erase the fear and humiliation I'd felt being dragged off the street, handcuffed, and locked up like a criminal? I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "You think this is just about me?" I asked, my voice rising. "This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a system that lets things like this happen over and over again. People like me aren't seen as individuals. We're seen as suspects, as threats, until someone realizes we're important. That's not justice, that's privilege." Harris didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at me with a mixture of guilt and resignation. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You're right," he admitted quietly, "and we need to do better, starting today." His words surprised me, not because they were profound or groundbreaking, but because they came from someone in his position. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, this could lead to real change. But hope alone wasn't enough. Actions spoke louder than words, and I wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Lieutenant Harris' admission hanging in the air like smoke. I could see the conflict in his eyes, guilt battling with duty, regret wrestling with protocol. It wasn't often that someone in his position admitted fault, especially not to someone like me. But there it was, plain as day, an acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong with the system he represented. "You're right," he repeated, his voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. "This isn't just about you. This is bigger than one mistake, and we need to fix it." I wanted to believe him. Really, I did. But trust doesn't come easy when you've been on the receiving end of injustice your entire life. So instead of softening, I leaned further into the moment, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Fix it." I shot back, my tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "How exactly do you plan to fix years of bias and prejudice? Do you think firing a couple of officers or writing a report is going to erase what happened tonight? Because let me tell you, Lieutenant, this isn't the first time someone has looked at me and assumed the worst. And unless things change, real change, it won't be the last." Harris flinched at my words, but he didn't interrupt. Maybe he knew I needed to say this, or maybe he realized there was no defense he could offer that would make this okay. "I'm not here to lecture you," I continued, my voice steadying as I found my rhythm. "But if you're serious about fixing this, then start by listening. Start by understanding why people are angry, not just today, but every single day. When you pull someone over because of how they look, you're not just making a mistake. You're reinforcing a narrative that says black lives don't matter, that we're all suspects until proven otherwise. And that hurts more than handcuffs ever could." The young officer who had escorted me into the room shifted uncomfortably near the door, his gaze fixed on the floor. Harris, meanwhile, rubbed his temples like he was trying to stave off a headache. For once, neither of them had anything to say. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally, Harris spoke again. "We'll launch an internal investigation immediately," he said, his tone firmer now, like he was regaining control of the situation. "And rest assured, disciplinary action will be taken against those responsible." Disciplinary action. Those two words felt hollow, like a bandage slapped over a gaping wound. Sure, suspending or reprimanding the officers involved might satisfy some people, but it wouldn't address the root of the problem. It wouldn't stop this from happening again, to me or to someone else. "That's not enough," I said bluntly, shaking my head. "Firing a few bad apples doesn't fix a rotten tree. What about training? Accountability? Transparency? Are you willing to put systems in place to ensure this never happens again? Or are you just looking for a quick way to save face?" Harris stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "This goes deeper than one incident. We'll review our policies, improve our training programs, and bring in outside experts to evaluate our practices. But I can't promise overnight results. Change takes time." "Time," I echoed, letting the word hang in the air. "That's what everyone always says. But while you're taking your time, people like me are still being treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of our skin. How much longer are we supposed to wait?" He didn't have an answer for that. None of them did. Instead, he stood up and extended his hand toward me. "I can't undo what happened tonight, Mr. Thompson. But I can promise you this, we'll do better, starting now." I hesitated before reaching out to shake his hand. Part of me wanted to refuse, to leave him sitting there with his unfulfilled promises and empty gestures. But another part, the part that still believed in the possibility of change, knew that rejecting his offer wouldn't help anyone. If I truly wanted to make a difference, I had to hold them accountable, to push for real reform, not just lip service. As I followed the young officer back down the hallway, my mind raced with possibilities. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever happened next, I was determined to turn this nightmare into something meaningful, something that would force the system to confront its flaws and hopefully begin to heal. By the time I stepped out of the police station, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The air felt different now, lighter, but not entirely free. My body ached from the long hours spent in that tiny holding cell, and my mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. But as I stood there on the steps of the station, watching the first rays of sunlight break through the clouds, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It couldn't be. Word had already started to spread. A small crowd had gathered outside the station. Neighbors, reporters, even a few community activists holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "No more wrongful arrests." Cameras flashed like lightning bugs in the early morning light, and microphones were thrust toward me before I'd even reached the bottom step. "Dr. Thompson, can you tell us what happened?" one reporter asked, her voice urgent. "How does it feel to be wrongfully arrested?" Another chimed in. "What are you going to do next?" I held up a hand, signaling for them to give me a moment. My head was spinning, not just from exhaustion, but from the sheer magnitude of what this moment meant. This wasn't just about clearing my name or holding a few officers accountable. This was an opportunity, a chance to shine a spotlight on a broken system and demand real change. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly at my sides. "This isn't about me," I began, looking directly into the camera so everyone watching would understand. "Yes, I was wrongfully arrested last night because of the color of my skin. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and unless we take action, it won't be the last." The crowd grew quiet, hanging onto every word. Even the reporters lowered their pens and recorders, listening intently. "This is about every person who has ever been judged by their appearance instead of their actions. Every child who grows up believing they'll never get a fair shake because of where they come from or how they look. Every family that's been torn apart by injustice. That's why this matters, not just for me, but for all of us." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others wiped tears from their eyes. I could see the weight of shared experiences in their faces, the pain, the frustration, the hope, and it fueled me to keep going. "I'm not here to play the victim," I continued, my voice rising with conviction. "I'm here to fight, for accountability, for transparency, for justice. We need reforms that go beyond empty promises, training programs that actually work, policies that prioritize fairness over bias, and most importantly, we need leaders who are willing to listen and act." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the walls of the station. People cheered, clapped, and chanted slogans like "Black Lives Matter" and "Enough is enough." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of solidarity, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. As the press conference wrapped up, Mayor Lewis herself arrived, flanked by her security detail. She approached me cautiously, her face pale and drawn, like she hadn't slept all night. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I am so sorry for what happened. Please, tell me how we can make this right." Her apology caught me off guard, but I didn't let it soften me completely. "Apologies are nice," I replied evenly, "but they don't fix broken systems. What I want, what we all want, is action. Real, meaningful change. Will you stand with us?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding firmly. "Yes, absolutely." It wasn't perfect, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But standing there, surrounded by people who believed in justice and equality, I felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something bigger, something better. In the days that followed, the story exploded like wildfire. News outlets couldn't get enough of it. Local stations led with headlines about the advocate who was wrongfully arrested, while national networks picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of systemic injustice. Social media buzzed with outrage and calls for reform. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EndRacial Profiling trending for days on end. It was surreal to see my face plastered across screens and newspapers, but what struck me most was the overwhelming support from people I'd never met. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories of being profiled or mistreated because of their race. Parents wrote letters saying they didn't want their children growing up in a world where skin color determined how safe you were. Even kids from the community center where I worked stopped by to give me hugs, telling me they were proud of me for standing up. For the first time, I realized just how powerful a single moment could be, not because of me, but because of what it represented. But as the attention grew, so did the pressure. Every interview request, every phone call from city officials, every email from activists felt like another weight added to my shoulders. I wasn't just Marcus Thompson anymore. I was a symbol, a face for a movement. And while I believed in the cause wholeheartedly, there were moments when I wondered if I was ready for this kind of responsibility. One afternoon, as I sat in my living room surrounded by stacks of papers and news clippings, Mayor Lewis called an emergency meeting at City Hall. She invited community leaders, police department representatives, and civil rights advocates to sit down together and discuss concrete steps toward reform. I agreed to attend, though part of me worried it would be another empty gesture, a chance for officials to pat themselves on the back without making real changes. The meeting room was packed when I arrived, filled with familiar faces and some I didn't recognize. Lieutenant Harris was there too, sitting quietly near the back, his expression unreadable. As I took my seat at the table, I noticed the tension in the air. It was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew this wasn't just a casual discussion. This was a reckoning. Mayor Lewis opened the meeting by apologizing publicly once again, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "What happened to Dr. Thompson is unacceptable," she said firmly. "It's a reflection of deeper issues within our system, and we owe it to him, and to everyone, to do better." Her words set the tone for the rest of the conversation. One by one, people spoke up, some demanding immediate action, others offering solutions. A young activist suggested implementing body cameras for all officers, along with regular audits to ensure accountability. An attorney proposed creating an independent oversight board to review complaints against law enforcement. Even Lieutenant Harris chimed in, advocating for mandatory bias training and stricter guidelines for identifying suspects. As the ideas flowed, I found myself taking notes, jotting down key points and questions. By the end of the meeting, we had drafted a preliminary plan. Sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency, improving officer training, and fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't solve everything overnight, but it was a start. When the meeting adjourned, Lieutenant Harris approached me hesitantly. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice low and sincere. "I know nothing I say can undo what happened, but thank you for pushing us to do better, for holding us accountable." I studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. Finally, I nodded. "Just don't let it happen again," I replied simply. He swallowed hard, nodding back. "It won't." Walking out of City Hall that evening, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, determination, and a cautious optimism. Change wouldn't come easily, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that progress was possible. That maybe, just maybe, this fight would lead to something meaningful, not just for me, but for generations to come. Weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial frenzy of media attention died down, but the impact of that night lingered, not just for me, but for the entire community. Slowly but surely, the reforms we discussed at City Hall started taking shape. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and an independent oversight board was established to review complaints against law enforcement. Training programs were revamped, focusing not only on de-escalation techniques, but also on addressing implicit bias. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. At the community center where I worked, things felt different too. Kids who had once been hesitant to talk about their fears now spoke openly about their hopes for the future. Parents stopped by more often, sharing stories of how they'd started having tough conversations with their children about race and justice. Even the staff seemed energized, inspired by the idea that our small corner of the world could contribute to something bigger. One afternoon, as I watched a group of kids playing basketball in the courtyard, I noticed Lieutenant Harris standing near the fence. He looked out of place in his crisp uniform, hands clasped behind his back, as he observed the scene. For a moment, I considered ignoring him. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive or forget. But then I remembered what this fight was really about: building bridges, not walls. "Lieutenant," I said, walking over to him, "what brings you here?" He turned quickly, startled, before relaxing slightly when he saw it was me. "Dr. Thompson," he replied, his tone respectful. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I just wanted to see the work you do firsthand." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by his honesty. "You didn't have to come all the way out here for that." "I know," he admitted, glancing at the kids laughing and shouting on the court. "But after everything that happened, I realized I didn't fully understand your world, the world of the people we're supposed to protect. I thought maybe seeing this place would help me do better." His words caught me off guard. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to justify past mistakes, just a genuine desire to learn and grow. And while it didn't erase what had happened, it gave me hope that real change was possible, even within the people who represented the system itself. "You're welcome here anytime," I told him finally, gesturing toward the kids. "They're the reason I do what I do. If you want to understand, start with them." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me come, and for pushing us to be better." We stood there for a while longer, watching the game unfold. The sound of sneakers squeaking against the pavement blended with the kids' laughter, creating a melody that felt almost sacred. In that moment, I realized something important. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, one that requires patience, effort, and a willingness to listen. Later that evening, as I sat on my porch sipping tea, I reflected on everything that had changed since that fateful night. My wrongful arrest had been a nightmare, yes, but it had also become a catalyst for accountability, for reform, for hope. I still carried the scars of that experience, both visible and invisible, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they reminded me of why I kept fighting. For every child who deserved to grow up in a fairer world, for every parent who dreamed of a brighter future, for every person who refused to let fear silence their voice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the support of my community, for the resilience of those who stood beside me, and for the belief that even in the face of injustice, light can prevail. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning, and I was ready.